Welcome to the Backyard Professor Responds videos. I ran across a very interesting interview, again by the very popular Julian Dory, where he is interviewing Lawrence Krauss. And Krauss is talking about aliens and God and the multiverse and the Bible, etc. And I never made it all the way through the interview. I must confess, I have been derelict in my duty commenting on a video before I completely watch it, but at this point I have no reason to. The very beginning is showing Krauss really beating up a vivid straw man argument against the concept of aliens traveling through the vast trillions of miles of interstellar space, simply because there's just not enough time. And that argument is really silly. That's assuming the aliens only travel as fast as we do, and that they can only use technology that is as good as ours, which is a ridiculous assumption, I would argue. And so I'm not impressed at all with his argument against the aliens being here. The other thing he says about the Bible right up front, within the first 6 minutes, caught my eye. So what I want to do is I will share this clip of Lawrence Krauss trying to justify the basis of his book of nothing. Everything comes from nothing. And he is trying to invoke the authority of the Bible to defend his claim. And it would help, in my honest opinion, if Krauss would at least put a little bit of effort into understanding what the Bible actually says, instead of just simply telling it what he thinks it says that fits with his own scientific assumptions. Let me show you what I mean. All right, let's hear what Mr. Krauss has to say. Turn up my sound.
Nothing is really hard to understand, and everyone has a different definition of it. And I had to talk about that when I wrote the book, because you're right, an empty room seems like nothing, but it's not nothing. The nothing of the Bible, which a lot of religious people like to say, oh, well, you're not really discussing nothing, you really need God to make something. But the nothing of the Bible really is an infinite empty void, so it's like empty space.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you read the Bible, the nothingness was an empty void. And if you think the best example of that is like space with nothing there. But then where did the space come from?
Yeah.
And that's his clip. Now, nowhere in the Bible is space described as an infinite empty void of nothing. He is simply reading his own scientific bias back into the ancient record, and it shows his fecund ignorance of the ancient Hebrew conception of creation. So I'm going to read some selections of the book that I have on this theme, and I really do think that it's important to, I get it, Lawrence Krauss is in the same tradition as Richard Dawkins and some of the so-called debunkers of the biblical text and of Christianity and Judaism and of religion at large. I get all that. But if you can't take care to understand what the text says, then you need to just quit using that text, would be my solemn advice. So in the Genesis account, the first verse is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Ve haaretz haita tohu vavohu v'hoshech al penei tohom. So, and the darkness was over the deep and all that jazz. The primary meaning of the verb bara in the Hebrew is to cut. You cut something already there, or else you separate 2 or 3 or 4 different things that's already there. You can also divide it. As James Atwell observed, The verb bara has a deliberate and a considered significance when it occurs in the P source, the priestly source. There are 4 originating document sources for the creation story, according to a theory called the documentary hypothesis. The J, E, P, and D, each one of them have their own agenda. And in antiquity, these 4 sources were stitched together to basically put together the book of Genesis. So, Atwell observes the word bara has a deliberate and considered significance in the priestly document, but this falls short of creation ex nihilo. Nowhere is space described as an infinite void. The word infinite is not used in the Bible for that use. It is best understood in the context of the alternative verbs of to separate or to make. The Hebrews did not believe that God created out of absolutely nothing, but rather that God organized the pre-existing chaos. This is important. How did he organize that chaos? By dividing and separating light from darkness, day from night, the heaven from the earth, the waters above the dome of the firmament, the rakia, from the waters beneath the firmament, as set forth in Genesis. Now, one of the great biblical scholars, E.A. Spicer, who produced the Anchor Bible series book of Genesis, his translation of Genesis 1 through 3, reads, when God set about to create heaven and earth, the world being a formless waste with darkness over the seas, God said, let there be light, and there was light. There's nothing here about an infinite space and void. This translation is significant because it means that chaos already existed. It pre-existed God's creative activity. The earth was already in a state of chaos. It wasn't in non-existence. It was just chaotic and without form when God began to create. And here's how Spicer says it. He says, to be sure, the present interpretation precludes the view that creation accounts in Genesis say nothing about coexistent matter. Thus, this translation supports the notion of creation from chaos. Spicer takes the first word of the Bible, translated in the King James as in the beginning. Now, this is the word bereshit, in the construct state. What this means, if bereshit is in the construct state, then it is a temporal clause. And this defines God when he set about to create. So in essence, what this means is the very first verse of the Bible, the word in Genesis, functions as a title of the work, as in other ancient Near Eastern accounts, notably the Babylonian Enuma Elish. So the first verse is subordinated to verse 3, with verse 2 taken as a parenthesis. So Spicer says it this way: the first word of Genesis, and hence the first word in the Hebrew Bible as a unit, is vocalized as bereshit. Grammatically, this is evidently in the construct state. Thus, the sense of this particular initial term is or should be at the beginning of, or when. It does not mean in or at the beginning. And the absolute form is what that would be. With the adverbial connotation, it would have read barashit, as the text is now vocalized, therefore. The Hebrew Bible starts out with a dependent clause. So he argues that God creates by organizing a chaos. And notice, chaos is not nothing out in the infinite void. No, that is not what heavens mean in Hebrew. He begins by organizing a chaos, and he does not create an absolute beginning at Genesis 1. The word translated in the King James Version as in the beginning consists of two words, abe, when or in, and reshit, the first or the initiation of action or the beginning. The word reshit occurs 50 times in the Old Testament and is always in the construct state, with only the possible debated exception of Isaiah 46:10. The word bereshit occurs elsewhere in the Old Testament only 4 times, remarkably enough, all of them happening in the book of Jeremiah, and always in the construct state, which requires it to be taken as a temporal clause, as Spicer translates it. As the word is vocalized in Hebrew in the present Bible, as shown by the vocal markings for the vowels, it is undoubtedly a construct and not an absolute. So what this means is the fact that the word bereshit is always in the construct form elsewhere in the Old Testament. This strongly supports the translation of Genesis 1:1 as a temporal clause, meaning we translate the first verse of the Bible as when God set about to separate the heavens and the earth. Notice, they're already there. They're not out of nothing. His version of creation is when he began to separate the two. Interesting. The view that Genesis 1:1-3 should be so translated was recognized long ago by the Hebrew scholar Rashi, who proposed that Genesis 1:1 constituted a dependent clause. He considered the first verse, Genesis 1:1, as the protasis, when God began to create, or in the beginning of God's creation. And then after verse 1, verse 2 is a parenthesis, the earth being was void. And verse 3 as the apodosis, God said, let there be light. So Rashi argued at the beginning of creation of heaven and earth, when the earth was desolate and void, there was darkness. And then God said, let there be light. Yehi or, vaihi or, let there be light, and there was light. This verse does not appear in order to show the order of creation at all and tell us that the heaven and the earth were created first. That's not what this verse is doing at all. Because whenever the word bereshit appears in Scripture, it is in the construct. So here too, Rashi says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth should be translated as in the beginning of God's creating the heaven and the earth. And he did so by separating heaven and earth, not creating them from an infinite void of nothing. So the interpretation of bereshit in the construct state means that it is bound to the following word or phrase and thus demands that Genesis is translated as a temporal clause. Rashi also argued that Genesis 1:1-3 does not provide the order of creation because the waters already exist before God begins his creation. He didn't create the waters from the ancient Hebrew text using the Hebrew. This order of creation is not indicated, but the state of the earth is what the Bible is emphasizing when God began to create. is emphasized. The creation of the earth was preceded by chaos. So the closest parallel account to Genesis 1 is Genesis 2, which scholars have identified as the J story, meaning the author of this chapter 2, was the Yahwist, because in this chapter, the Yahwist used the name Yahweh for God, not Elohim. Okay, so it shows that the temporal clause is precisely the structure used to begin creation accounts in the Hebrew mindset. This reading is also supported by the syntax of the account of Genesis 1, because chapter 1, verse 2 begins with the vav, the translated word and, or but, or now, or even also, accompanied by a noun and a verb. Such a syntax in the Hebrew supports the view that Genesis 1:2 is in fact a parenthetical statement that sets it off as a disjunctive from verse 1. It's not about order of creation at all. These considerations are strong reasons indeed to adopt the reading of Genesis 1 favored by Spicer, and those taking the view that it teaches that God created by organizing a pre-existent chaos by separation, cutting apart, etc. Both Genesis 1 and 2 envisioned the world as existing in a chaotic state prior to creation. So as Louis Stadelman says in his excellent work, The Hebrew Conception of the World, here's yet again another biblical scholar that Lawrence Krauss would do well to familiarize himself with. It has long been recognized by Bible scholars that the priestly account of creation of the world in Genesis chapter 1 reveals traces of Mesopotamian influence. This influence is most apparent in the cosmological presuppositions. And in this sense, the Hebrew priestly account differs significantly in outlook from that of the Yahwist account in Genesis chapter 2. For example, whereas the Yahwist record envisages the primeval state as a desert needing water to make it fertile, the priestly account presupposes the existence of an unformed chaos enveloped in primeval darkness. The world is pictured as being then a formless waste, with darkness over the seas, in short, a watery chaos. The passage concerned seems to indicate a situation in which the world is envisaged as immersed in the Thum, the seas. As further development of the idea shows, the chief features of this primordial chaos are those of the raw material of the universe, which is already there when God began his creation. Umberto Cassuto described the arrangement of chaos as follows. In this chaos of unformed matter, the heaviest elements were naturally at the bottom of the waters, which were the lightest floated on top. This apart, the whole material was an undifferentiated, unorganized, confused, and lifeless agglomeration. It is this terrestrial state that is called tohu vavohu, a formless waste. Not nothing, not an infinite void, no, a formless waste. I would add that there can be little doubt that the Hebrew word tohu, when used alone with vohu, means primarily a desert or a wasteland. When God began to create, there was already a pre-existing chaos. So, now another gentleman, Simpkins, Ronald Simpkins, noted that the ancient Near Eastern sources adopt metaphors of separation and differentiation as God's mode of creation. In the Sumerian Gilgamesh epic, creation begins with the separation of earth from heaven. In the creation of the pickaxe Enlil, another Sumerian account, the god of air separates the originally united heaven and earth. In both of these myths, the creation metaphors present creation as the process of differentiation through the establishment of boundaries. The Enuma Elish begins with the same metaphor of separation of heaven and earth by splitting and arranging the corpse of Tiamat, representing the division of the chaotic waters. The Hebrew word tahom, found in Genesis 1:2, is a cognate of the Babylonian word Tiamat, meaning sea, and is translated as the deep in the King James Version. As Simpkins observed, creation in the Bible is never ex nihilo, from nothing. This doctrine was not formulated until the Hellenistic age, that is, approximately, after Alexander the Great. After he died and his world was broke up into three main empires, about 200 BC is safe to say that, the Hellenistic age. In the biblical tradition and in the ancient Near East in general, God always worked with some material. And that material can either be primordial or already there when God begins to create, though the ancient Israelites would not have made this distinction. God creates either through establishing order and fixing boundaries, and he does this usually by separating a primordial substance, or through the naturally physical processes of birth and growth. In the Yahweh's creation myth, the earth itself is primordial. God never creates the earth, but the earth without God's creative activity is barren and lifeless. So, my advice to scientists who love to, they love to kind of try to twit the idea of God, or they twit the idea of the primitive concept of creation in the Bible, etc., and that it makes religion all a hash and monkey business and stupid ridiculousness. If you can't even take the time to get correct how the Bible proffers its own ancient Hebrew view, why on earth am I supposed to believe that you've taken the time to understand the science you espouse as being so superior to the ancient Hebrew religion? I can't do that in all seriousness until you begin to show me you can understand your own sources much better than you do. Thanks for watching my BYP Responds videos. I'll be back with a whole lot more. I'm coming back tomorrow night, 6 o'clock, talking about the indefatigable and terrific scientist, Gary Nolan. You don't want to miss that one. Have a great night.